One of the things that I enjoy as somebody who spends way too much time cataloging video games are franchises that have way more games than people would expect. Quick example, how many Kicks games are there? You know, the classic Taito arcade game about filling in areas of the screen with colors to trap a bouncing line. Kicks has been cloned many times, but how many actual Kicks games are there? Answer, there's at least 8. The counting is actually kind of complicated here because Kicks 2 is a very slightly modified Kicks 1, and Kicks Neo and Volfeed are very slightly modified versions of Super Kicks. My point here is, there's a lot of Kicks games out there that even Kicks fans might not be aware of. Here's another example. How many Wizardry games are there? Surtech made Wizardry 8 and then went out of business, so it must be 8, right? If you've got a good memory, you might have remembered Nemesis the Wizardry adventure. Well, thanks to some contractual shenanigans, Japanese developers had the rights to make their own Wizardry games, and they made 25 of them. The Wizardry series currently stands at 34 games by my count. And of course there's some fuzziness there because some of the remakes and re-releases had original content, so if we start counting those, then we're past 40. Some games that you just wouldn't expect keep getting fresh sequels or reimaginings every few years. Which brings me to the subject of this video, Yars Revenge. One of the biggest games for the Atari video computer system, or the 2600 if you want to use its later catalog number, and it's a game where many people would be surprised that there's more than one of them. Okay, these days there'd be many people who are surprised that there was even one of them, but that's neither here nor there. I'm going to talk about 9 Yars Revenge games, though 2 of them I would just consider ports of the original since they don't add anything new. But I'm both going for completeness, and those releases help tell the story. Rather conveniently, the Yars Revenge story connects to a lot of the major beats of the story of Atari itself. It begins in the decadent heights moments before the fall, picks up again in the ruins of the Jaguar, has a secretive and messy release at a moment when Atari has been reduced to just a brand, winds up at the heart of a desperate attempt to save the company, was part of an initiative from someone who is perhaps the craziest figure in the history of Atari, and finally wound up in a place where it's reflecting on its origins while trying to move into the future. Yars Revenge is a game franchise that goes places. And to get into it, we're going to 1982. Atari is 10 years old at this point. Warner Brothers has taken a firm grip on the company, Nolan Bushnell's headed off to make pizza parlors, and Atari can't make games fast enough to keep up with demand. Atari is on a hiring spree, looking for any warm bodies that can make games. And they lucked out when they hired Howard Scott Warshaw. In his brief tenure at Atari, Warshaw would prove to be both skilled and fast at creating games. He had 3 games released in 1982. They would also turn out to be the only Atari games he released. The first task he was given when he started his new job was to create a port of Star Castle. These days, Star Castle isn't especially well known, but it is one of those games beloved by early arcade sickos. The kind of game that required a decent amount of skill just to play it, and a lot of skill to do well. The goal in Star Castle is to destroy the layers of shields around the titular Star Castle, then blow up the structure. Your ship operates with very little inertia, speeding up when you hit thrust and very slowly gliding to a stop. Exiting off one side of the screen makes you reappear on the other. It's all very similar to asteroids, though it's easier to come to a stop here. The Star Castle protects itself in 3 ways. First, there are the shields that rotate around it, and you have to blast segments of it off to expose the castle. If you completely destroy a ring, then a new ring generates, pushing the remaining rings outward. The second defense of the Star Castle are the fireballs that start out attached to the shield, but can launch and pursue your ship. These can be destroyed while they're attached to the shield, or they can be shot down while they're flying around. The final defense is the toughest one to get through. If there's a clean line of sight to your ship, the Star Castle will fire a very rapid shot at you. So when you get that hole into the inner layer, it's also a threat against you. The castle turns slowly, so you can maneuver in a way that there will be a gap that you can fire through, but the castle doesn't have you in its sights. Warshaw looked at Star Castle, looked at the capabilities of the Atari VCS, and decided that he couldn't make a proper port. Any version of Star Castle that he made would be so compromised that it wouldn't resemble the original game. So Warshaw went to his boss with a proposal. What if he made a game that was kinda like Star Castle, but wasn't really? Warshaw got told to go for it, and he started development on the game that would become Yars Revenge. While I'm still at the beginning of this video, let's take a few moments to pull apart that title, because the series has been wildly inconsistent about it. In this first game, it is spelled Y-A-R-S apostrophe, Revenge. As in, this is the revenge of the collective group of fly people called Yar. Later on, it will be Y-A-R apostrophe S, Revenge, because there's a single Yar in the process of taking revenge. And then some releases drop the apostrophe altogether. I guess Yars is an adjective in those titles. My point is, you're going to see inconsistency with the titles in this video. Don't worry about them. Nobody at Atari did. The VCS version of Yars Revenge underwent extensive focus group testing. That let Warshaw polish off all of the rough edges in the game. And when it was finished, Atari recognized that they had something really special. Yars Revenge became the focus of Atari's big 1982 marketing push.
A fly. I'll have a mutant fly. Hello, Yar. You'll need some protection. Ion zone.
The commercial was produced for movie theaters that really focused on the game. Atari's faith in Yars Revenge paid off. It was the best-selling original title created for the Atari VCS. In other words, a game that wasn't an arcade port. The name Yar came from Atari CEO Ray Kazar. Warshaw just spelled Ray backward. As far as I can tell, this wasn't intended as an insult. He wasn't saying Ray Kazar was a housefly. It was just a way to come up with a weird title. For some reason, Atari decided that they needed to explain the premise of the game to people who bought it. A space fly going through a rainbow to attack a weird blob on the far side of the screen was just too out there. And so Yars Revenge came with a short, well, they call it a comic book, but it's really more of an illustrated storybook. There's not much in the way of sequential art happening here. In fact, it's not much of a story, since the events are a Yar soldier goes into a room, gets told things that they should already know, and then at the very end flies off to battle. Still, since Yars Revenge is one of the few VCS games to have a story, elements from this comic are going to come back quite a bit as I progress through the series. So let's take a look at it. The comic was written by Hope Schaefer, who wrote a lot of this kind of supplemental material for Atari, and the art was by Frank Sirocco. And his best-known comic book work is probably as the creator of Alien Legion, which even as a comic book fan is a bit of a deep cut. The cover of the comic, which is the same as the game's cover, was painted by Hiro Kimura. He painted a bunch of cover art for Atari in 1982 and 83. For our story, the commander tells the new recruit that Yar are descended from houseflies that were on a crashed spaceship. Radiation from the crash mutated the Yars into a humanoid form, and they proceeded to colonize the solar system that they found themselves in. Yars can fly freely through space, eat anything, and shoot fireballs. The Yars were so peaceful that they created a devastating superweapon called the Zorlon Cannon. Before the weapon was finished, they were attacked by their enemy, the Kotile. That's spelled with a Q at the front. The Kotile destroyed the middle planet of their solar system, and the Yars vowed revenge. The remains of the destroyed Yar world has become a neutral zone, and on the opposite side of that, the Kotile have built a base with a force shield around it. The Kotile can fire their guided destroyer missiles and devastating swirls from behind the safety of the shield. The neutral zone negates the missile, but it cannot stop the swirl. The Yar warrior must first break through the shield by either eating it or destroying it with its fireballs, then alert the surviving Yar planet that there's an opening for the newly completed Zorlon cannon to fire into, and the cannon will fire at the coordinates of that Yar warrior, so they'll need to use themselves to line up the shot and then get out of the way. And so the Yar warrior heads off to planet Ep, home of the Kotile, to get revenge. Well, conveniently, all of that exposition explained a lot of the video game mechanics. Why, there's hardly anything left for me. Since Warner Brothers owned Atari, and they were a big media company, they made a storybook record for Yars, which is actually mostly the comic. It mainly describes what the Yar are and what they can do. But it does go a little bit further, as there is a short dramatization of playing the game.
Later that day, a young Yar warrior returned home to say goodbye to his parents. Although he was brave, he was also aware of the risks involved in such a dangerous mission. He knew he might never see his family again.
If the comic was too much for people, well, the TV commercial also had a nice explanation of what Yars Revenge was.
You're a fly named Yar on a quest in space. You attack the shield of the Kotile's base, but watch out, Yar. He knows where you are. Yar's Revenge is new from Atari. Have you played Atari today?
I think more video games these days should have jingles to explain what they are. Like many Atari games of this period, Yars Revenge had a modular difficulty. When you powered the system on, it defaulted to a very, very easy mode. But by hitting the game select button a few times to rotate through the different game modes, adding a little bit more complexity as it goes. For this video, I'm playing Game Mode 6, which the manual tells me is Ultimate Yars. I think this is the most interesting way to play the game, so if you want to try Yars Revenge, I definitely recommend going straight to it. There's also a difficulty switch that goes between A and B. B is the easier version, which is something consistent among most Atari games. And if you wanted to, you could even change this difficulty on the, fly. The comic gave you an outline of the basic gameplay, but to show it off here really quick. On every stage, your goal is to destroy the Kotal, which is that shape that looks like it has eyes on the far right of the screen. Your Yar warrior will need to either shoot its way through the force field, or just run up to it and keep pushing into it, which will eat away one chunk at a time. Once you're ready, you go back to the far left-hand side of the screen, touch the edge of it, and then you'll see the Zorlon cannon beam appear on the left edge. The beam moves vertically with your Yar, even if you go off the top of the screen and reappear at the bottom. And the next time you hit the fire button, it launches and travels across the screen. If it hits the Kotile, then there's a big explosion effect, and you go on to the next stage. The complications for you are the little line that indicates the destroyer missile. This always follows you around the screen, but if you go into that rainbow static, it can't hurt you anymore. If you know any trivia about Yars Revenge, then you know this. The effect of that neutral zone stripe was created by just copying the program code from the ROM into the video out stream. Technically, if you went frame by frame, you could use that information to recreate Yars Revenge. From time to time, the Kotal will make a noise, and then it will turn into a spiral attack. That's the swirl, and it will fire straight out at your Yar after a moment. You can use that to your advantage, though, because when the swirl comes out, you can shoot it with the Zorlon cannon, and that counts as destroying the Kotile. That gets you a lot of points and an extra life. It's also not really that hard to do. There's also one more special thing about that. If you shoot the swirl while it's flying, then there will be a black line in the stage explosion, and if you rush over to that while the screen is clearing, then you'll trigger an Easter egg. Howard Scott Warshaw's initials appear instead of the score. That's the basic gameplay. Now let's start adding some twists. With the difficulty switch in the A position, the swirl moves faster, and the destroyer missile can block the Zorlon cannon. Turning up the game mode once adds a second stage configuration. Instead of a static bubble around the co-tile, there's a square block where all of the cells are moving inside it. So when you shoot or eat out a part of it, then that hole will rotate through the shield. That second shield formation will require a bit more patience, since you need to clear out a lot more of the shield in order to have a clear shot. Or, you could wait for the swirl to come out. The next game complication causes the Zorlon cannon to bounce back at you if it hits the shield. Since you can shoot yourself with the Zorlon cannon, you're going to have to take some extra care. And then we reach Ultimate Yars. The twist in Ultimate Yars is that it no longer takes eating one part of the shield or touching the co-tile once to activate the Zorlon cannon. Instead, activating the cannon requires a certain amount of energy, and you'll have to build it up before you can fire. That means eating more of the shield, or you can dip in and out of contact with the co-tile, which is always risky, since it's fatal if it turns into the swirl while you're doing that. And once you've got enough power, then you can go back to the far left of the screen and activate the cannon. The energy units are stored in a single byte, so the manual warns you that if you get more than 255 energy units, then you overload. In other words, it rolls over to 0 again. I wouldn't expect to see that happen in any kind of normal gameplay, though. One convenient trick in Ultimate Yars mode is that if the Zorlon cannon bounces back, it's no longer fatal to you. You can catch it to recover almost all of the energy you used. I feel like the Ultimate Yars mode adds enough complication to the game that it becomes an interesting challenge, but it's not overwhelming. Once you reach the score levels to bump things up a bit, staying ahead of the now rapidly moving destroyer missile and dodging the nearly constant swirls becomes very intense. While Yars Revenge is definitely limited by that VCS hardware, it's got the give and take, risk and reward that the best arcade games of that era had. You can play it safe and blast away at the shields from a distance, but you still need to pick moments to get your energy up. Or you can get in close, but that destroyer missile will be on top of you fast and you won't have anywhere to go. Maybe the biggest problem with Yars Revenge is that once you've really got a feel for its systems, then it's not the most difficult of games. Learning how to line up an interception with the swirl will give you effectively infinite lives while running up your score. But maybe the fact that it wasn't crazy difficult is what helped make Yars Revenge crazy popular. Following the success of Yars Revenge, Howard Scott Warshaw wound up being given other high-profile tasks at Atari. He made the Raiders of the Lost Ark game, which was a wildly ambitious adventure game that's a bit of a mess to play, but was still hugely successful for Atari. And with 2 hits under his belt, he drew the plum assignment of making a game based on the summer's biggest film, E.T. That's a game where the nicest thing I can say about it is that it did not kill the console industry. Warshaw had other projects in development, but none of them came to fruition at Atari. At least, that Atari. And so, this is the starting point of our franchise. A humble game, but one that was extremely successful in its day, still well regarded as one of the best games for the Atari VCS, the kind of game where people can become nostalgic for it. 17 years would pass before the Yars sought revenge again. A lot has happened to Atari in the past 17 years. A whole series of dominoes culminating in this moment. Incredibly poor management led to the collapse of Atari's console business in 1984. The assets were divided between a console and computer division, Atari Corporation, and what was mostly the arcade division, which became Atari Games. The fact that there were 2 different Atari game companies would cause no problems whatsoever for people. Our story follows the Atari Corporation line, and in the shifting video game landscape of the late 80s, they struggled to regain any traction. The computers were doing okay-ish, but the consoles felt lost. Maybe their most successful product at the time was the Atari 2600, revamping the VCS and re-releasing it as a low-end platform.
The fun is back, oh yes, sirree. It's the 2600 from Atari.
That kept games coming out for it until the 90s. The Atari 7800 was an attempt to revive some dead stock. They had manufactured the machines and had them ready to go in 1984, and then couldn't sell them because of market conditions. Once Nintendo's NES got retailers in the US excited for video games again, Atari pulled the 7800 out of mothballs, but didn't have the software support that the platform needed ready to go. Something that becomes a reoccurring theme. The portable Link system was brought to Atari by Epyx. They designed it but couldn't afford to make it. Atari took up the system, which was technically impressive for its day, and it got blown out of the water by Nintendo's Game Boy. Nintendo might not have had a color screen, but they were creaming Atari in software support and price. And then there was the Jaguar. And this is the thread that ties back to Yars Revenge. The Jaguar was Atari's attempt to get back into the big time. One last shot. A 32-bit system that they lied in the advertising and said it was 64-bit. The Jaguar was ready to compete with the hottest new systems on the market, the 3DO and the CDI. And then they launched with pretty much no software support. By the time games did start coming out for the Jaguar, two new consoles were entering the arena, the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. They had no chance there. And so in 1996, Atari Corporation started winding down. It'd be a couple years before they sold off everything, but the company was done. Well, the weird thing was, the Jaguar wasn't quite finished. Telegames, one of the very few third parties to support the Jaguar, took up the banner of the system and continued to publish Jaguar games for another 2 years. They even licensed a few properties from Atari Corporation. Atari Corporation, meanwhile, was selling off their assets to Hasbro. And all of this came together at a moment. While this was happening, someone figured out how to revive an old property and turn that nostalgia into gold. Konami and Hasbro weren't the first people to try this, but they were the first to make a giant dump truck full of money doing it. They revived Frogger in 1997, and it became one of the biggest hits in video game history. Not only did it sell well, it kept selling well. The runaway success of Frogger is often pointed to as one of the reasons Hasbro was willing to buy the Atari library. And as soon as Hasbro had their hands on it, they started cranking out updates to classic Atari games. While these might not have found the same success as Frogger, they still did pretty well for Hasbro. However, Hasbro might have owned those Atari assets. There were some existing licensing agreements that had to play out. Activision got to the library before Hasbro, but didn't buy it, so they just released games like Asteroids and Battlezone. While Telegames picked up a couple of titles that were still getting Jaguar releases, Breakout, Iron Soldier, and of course, Yars Revenge. By the time Telegames was ready to use the Yars Revenge license, they couldn't justify a Jaguar release anymore. And so they made a version for the Game Boy Color. In the style of the time, it features a lot of the same basic gameplay as the original Yars Revenge, and piles a lot more on top of it. One of the things that you'll notice in the 1999 version of Yars Revenge is that the title screen and the between stage screen are scans from the original Yars Revenge comic. If you let it sit on the title screen, then eventually it'll go to a display of the things you'll encounter in the game, and that's all you get there. You'll notice that there's a password entry on the title screen, and you'll also notice that if you go to enter a password, suddenly the music slows down. Entering the password, which consists of 4 shapes, is too intensive of a process for this game. That should give you an idea of what we're in for. But there's a bit more than that. One of the things that I wanted to do with this video is actually complete all of the games. Or complete them as far as they can be completed. After all, the original Yars Revenge is just an arcade-style score attack. The back of the box for this version of Yars Revenge assures me that there are more than 250 levels, which is computer nerd speak for 255. Actually, there's 256, but I will get there. When I started playing, a big question for me was whether or not there actually were that many distinct stages, or if the game just stopped adding anything after a few levels and then repeated until you flipped that byte. I didn't have an answer for this, because I couldn't find video of anyone playing the game for more than 4 or 5 minutes. So I will let you know up front that I did complete every single stage in the game, and I might be the first person to have video of the ending. God help me. I want to point out one more notable thing from the back of the box. According to it, the fly is named Yars. It's not one of the Yar. So the title is already shifting meanings. Most of the game mechanics here are the same as the original Yars Revenge, particularly that ultimate Yars mode. You eat the shield to build up energy, you go back and touch the far wall to activate the Zorlon cannon, and your goal is to shoot the Kotile that is on the far right. You've seen that, we're not going to get any further into it. Let's focus on the differences here. The first and most obvious is that the screen now scrolls horizontally. This winds up being a very bad thing. Although there's always an arrow pointing to the current location of the Kotile, you really can't see what's coming at you when the screen scrolls. When is the Kotile firing the swirl? You don't know until it flies in from the side of the screen. And on later levels, when things like the missile are moving very quickly, you can scroll it onto the screen and be dead in a moment. And that doesn't even get into the Zone Guardians. I'll get to the Zone Guardians. Another difference in this version, and likely related to the screen scrolling, is that you can no longer shoot through the neutral zone. Before, the neutral zone only prevented you from firing. Now your shots stop when they reach the far side of it. So you cannot sit on the far left and clear away the shield around the Kotile. The final significant change to the basic gameplay, and perhaps the most annoying, is how much the shield shoves your Yar warrior out of the way. Now this was always a thing. You could push up against the shield and it would push you to the left. But the fuzzy effect boundaries of the shield here means you go flying a lot further and a lot faster when you're in the general vicinity of the shield. It makes it more frustrating to munch on that shield, especially on the stages where the gaps are rotating through. You are going to get shoved into a missile or other object. The first 24 stages of Yars Revenge are just like the original VCS game. There's escalating challenges as the Kotile starts to move, the destroyer missile gets faster, you get less time between swirls, and the swirl shot moves faster. Level 25, they add Zone Guardians to the mix. I hate the Zone Guardians. They are one of the most annoying enemies I have ever encountered in a video game. At level 45, the Builder, which is the final additional complication, gets added to the mix. The Builder is easier to explain. It flies in from the top of the screen, goes in front of the Kotile, and drops a few additional blocks of shield. If you shoot it before it drops its blocks, then it retreats and comes back later. But the Zone Guardians continually spawn at the edges of the screen. You know, places that you'll want to be to quickly get away from the destroyer missile, since it can't track you through the wrap. And if Yars touches a Zone Guardian, then it gets frozen in place for a few seconds. Of course, by the time the Zone Guardians appear, you usually don't have a few seconds of safety where you can be frozen in place. But let's say that you survive getting struck by a Zone Guardian. You also lose any charge that you've built up for activating the Zorlon cannon. And since after you've dodged the destroyer missile and gobbled up enough energy to activate the Zorlon cannon, you have to scroll the screen and touch the back edge of the play area, it's pretty easy to just blunder right into a Zone Guardian as it spawns. And so you turn around, go back, and do it all over again. It's like the Zone Guardians were specifically made to be as annoying and disruptive as possible. They are just awful. After you destroy the Kotile, you'll get a screen-clearing flash, just like the original game, and sometimes you will see another fly. This fly will copy your movements, but do them more slowly, and if you manage to catch it, then you go to a bonus stage. Here your goal is to move Yars on top of the Ghost of Yars. That's the other fly. and for every frame where you're in contact, the counter ticks up. While you're chasing down the ghost, asteroids randomly spawn in on the right-hand side, and if you run into one of those, then you're knocked way back. The asteroids are dense and totally random, and the Ghost of Yars starts about 75% of the way toward the edge of the screen. The result is a bonus stage that is just completely frustrating. Now, as your reward for the bonus stage, you'll get points. Just 1 point for every tick. But for every 20 points, you earn an extra life. Why they mix this into the points system, I don't know. But they did. Just to rub some extra salt in, there's a maximum of 99 points that can be earned this way. 1 point shy of 5 lives. And as one final bit of annoyance, sometimes the Ghost of Yars spawns right on top of you in that stage clearing moment. Then you just get thrown into the bonus stage the instant you kill the Kotile. At least there's a text screen to give you some warning. If you get a game over, and you will, then the password on the title screen automatically updates to the one for the level you died at least until you reach level 240. That's the final password, and if you want to see the end credits, then you have to play from 240 on without using a continue. Or, wait a couple minutes for me to show you the ending. Yars Revenge is one of those Game Boy Color carts that fully supports the original Game Boy. Honestly, I think it looks a little bit better with the limited color palette. It works just fine this way, but for the most part, I stuck to the color version while I was playing. Okay, so let's get to the big question here. How do you beat a game with 255 levels that has been designed to drag things out? Well, after I cleared about the first dozen stages, I realized I had no chance of completing the full game unless I started using other strategies. Primarily, I gave up trying to dig through the shield and tried to line myself up to counterattack the swirl when it got shot out. As I progressed through the game, the swirls started getting fired more often, and that meant intercepting it was much faster than playing out the whole level. I started making very rapid progress with this strategy. It took me less than an hour to go from stage 12 to stage 50, and then I hit a brick wall. You see, at stage 50, the neutral zone is getting weakened. It's become a much narrower strip. Now you may be going, oh, you only have half the shield area. But that's not the problem. You do most of your dodging vertically. If you're using the shield against the destroyer missile, then it doesn't matter that it's narrower. No, the problem is that the neutral zone has moved backwards. The consequence of that is you have to move a lot further forward in order to fire the Zorlon cannon, and that puts you in a much more exposed position for everything. At this point in the game, everything is attacking at max speed, those zone defenders are spawning much more rapidly, and then they make using the Zorlon cannon even harder. It was taking me about 10 minutes to clear a stage, and I thought that I was done. But somehow, I managed to clear up to stage 64. At stage 64, the neutral zone has been destroyed. No more shield, but I don't need that shield anyways. The Kotile gets a much bigger shield of its own that you have to break through, but it's not that much different from what you've been dealing with. At that point, I started making some real progress. At stage 80, you're told that the Kotile shield has been destroyed, and then at stage 80 you see that the Kotile shield is still there. What's happening is that you have now reached the final point of the game. Every pair of stages from this point on, except the very last one, is identical. You have one stage with the square layout shield, where the blocks are rotating through it, and then you have a stage where there is no shield for the Kotile at all. And it alternates those two until the end. So, you know that moment in martial arts movies when the guy's been getting beaten up, and then he reveals that he's been intentionally fighting with a significant handicap the whole time? I cleared the next 100 stages in 20 minutes. I slowed down around level 200 because I took a break for about 20 minutes and came back with a bad case of Nintendo thumb. I had found a consistent rhythm for clearing stages. Shield levels, go forward, jig to the top right around the destroyer missile, You have just enough time to eat the shields, get back to activate the Zorlon cannon, and be in a perfect position to intercept the swirl. For the stages without the shield, it was even easier. Fake out the destroyer missile, bash your face into the Kotile, hang out a moment to let the destroyer missile go to the right, and then head back to activate the Zorlon cannon just in time to shoot the swirl down. And here it is, the final stage. Level 255 of the Game Boy Color version of Yars Revenge. And it just displays the credits over a regular level. I did not cheat to get that far, so per the credit screen, I must be very sick. Now there's one more annoying thing here, because this is Yars Revenge for the Game Boy Color. They put the destroyer missile on top of the Kotile, so you can't build up energy for the Zorlon cannon and then complete this stage. If you try, you explode. Unless you approach it from the top or bottom and go very gently, in which case you can get enough power and shoot the Kotile. That sends you to Stage 0. Stage 0 is just the first level again, but this is the only way that you can reach it. Clear Stage 0 when you're back at Stage 1, and you can do the loop again if you really wanted to. So after all that, was it worth it? No, hell no. I told you that the last 174 levels were the same. On top of that, this is a bad version of Yars Revenge. The elements they added to the game made it worse. If they had scaled the gameplay down to fit on a single screen, which would have involved a lot of compromises on the original Game Boy, but you still could do it, and then tried building up from there, then this might have turned out decently. In fact, spoilers for where this video is going, that's an approach that's been taken with Yars in recent years, and it's been effective. The Game Boy Color version of Yars Revenge feels like a quick attempt to cash in on nostalgia. It comes across like only the barest minimum of effort has been put into it. The only reason I'm not outright calling it the low point of the Yars Revenge franchise is that the next game I'm going to talk about is kind of messy. So let's move ahead 6 years. What a difference a few years make. In 1998, Hasbro Interactive was the next big thing. They were bringing back that Atari brand, they had a lot of hit games under their belt, everything was smooth sailing. You know, until the moment it wasn't. Likely because they tried to expand too much too fast. Hasbro Interactive was losing huge amounts of money in 1999, just in time for the stock market to turn against all tech stocks. Suddenly, Hasbro repositioning themselves as a video game company was a bad idea, and since they always had the toys to fall back on, Hasbro decided to get rid of it. Fortunately for Hasbro, a French publisher was on a buying spree. Infogrames had just acquired GT Interactive, another large American game publisher, and had basically turned them into their American branch. They bought the Hasbro Interactive assets, and then Infogrames decided it was time to rebrand. All of those new American companies they acquired were placed under the label Atari. That new Atari wasn't making much that had a connection to the old Atari. They were just making games. And that's where we pick up our story. You've got an Atari, that's actually GT Interactive, who owns all of the Hasbro stuff, and that Atari is controlled by Infogrames. A few years after this, Infogrames is going to fold itself into Atari, but that's all just paperwork. Atari is now GT Interactive and Infogrames. That's what matters. Initially, Atari was struggling to figure out how to use old Atari material. As I go forward here, I'm going to talk about the 3 different ways that this shook out. First up is the most forward-looking of them. They owned all of this Atari stuff. Why don't they release another Atari console? Little devices that let you plug into a television set and play some simple games were kind of popular at the time. If people were making little joysticks that had NES games in them, why not Atari? And so the Atari Flashback was born. The first Atari Flashback is extra weird, because it's not an Atari, it's a Nintendo. Outwardly, the 2004 version of the Atari Flashback looks like an Atari 7800 system. It offered 20 games like Breakout, Food Fight, and Yars Revenge. But the games didn't play the same as the originals, because the Atari Flashback was hastily assembled in the space of 2 months using off-the-shelf components, and the heart of that system was the classic NES on a chip. That's right, you're looking at the NES version of Yars Revenge. People figured out how to clone the Nintendo Entertainment System and put all of that hardware onto one microchip. Now, these clones weren't especially good, more that companies found them to be good enough. A lot of the cheap video game hardware that you found lining toy aisles in the early 2000s ran off of this NES on a chip, because there were plenty of developers who were already familiar with the platform. So in those 2 months of development, the Flashback team ported 20 Atari games to the NES. Shockingly, having an average of 3 days of development per game turned out to be a pretty bad idea. I don't want to drill into how bad this port of Yars Revenge is, because, I mean, just look at it. This is the version of Yars Revenge you buy from a stall at a flea market where all of the game cartridges have pictures of RoboCop on the label. It sounds wrong, it controls worse, and only half of that is down to the Atari Flashback using miniaturized versions of the Atari 7800 joystick. You can phase through the Kotile's shield, a close miss with the swirl will activate the Zorlon cannon. Everything about this version of Yars Revenge is just wrong. The Atari Flashback seems to have sold decently, even though a lot of people were pretty unhappy with it. In response, Atari went the complete opposite direction with the Atari Flashback 2. It's not NES on a chip, it's not emulation. They actually made new VCS consoles. Okay, kind of. What happened is that they looked at the NES on a chip and made a VCS on a chip. It works well enough that you can mod a cartridge port into the Flashback 2 and play other VCS games. But it's also limited enough that the list of incompatible games is pretty long. Still, new VCSs, and they work the way they're supposed to. The Flashback 2 had 42 built-in games, and they weren't just the same Atari games. A couple of Activision titles were included, and the strangest inclusions would be the prototypes and homebrew hacks of other games. There's Adventure 2 that's just Adventure 1, only the world's been modified. Saboteur, a prototype that had never seen the light of day until that point. The original design of Saboteur was by Howard Scott Warshaw, so you'll see a cameo from one of the Yar flies. And the reason that I'm talking about the Flashback 2, a new game built on Yars Revenge's code called Yars Return. So this was pretty neat. Whole new Atari VCS games, only available on the Atari Flashback 2. Just one small problem, many of them didn't really work, including Yars Return. But Yars Return did not stop at the Flashback 2. Now things get kind of weird. Rather than continuing to manufacture the Atari Flashback systems, Atari licensed that platform out to AtGames. And when I said that name, there's a large portion of my audience who just went, ugh. AtGames was making a lot of those plug-and-play consoles at the time, and they're almost universally critically flawed. For the Atari Flashback line, AtGames stopped using that VCS on a chip and started using a processor running an emulator. The game lineup would shift rather dramatically under AtGames, and they dropped Yars Return. For 10 years, the game was not seen, but a cleaned-up, improved version came back for the Atari Flashback 6 in 2015. And every Atari Flashback since then has included Yars Return. And strangely enough, that includes the Atari Flashback releases for consoles. Yars Return can be found on the Atari Flashback Classics for the Nintendo Switch, and on Volume 3 of that collection for the PS4 and Xbox Series X. The PS4 version is the one that I'm playing just for the sake of having the nicest output. Finally, Yars Return was cleaned up again and released as a limited edition cartridge in 2022. So there's 3 different versions of the game out there, one of them effectively unplayable. From what I've seen, the gameplay differences between that later cartridge release and the flashback release are minimal. Mainly, there's a title screen added, but there's also some gameplay tweaks. The PS4 version that I'm playing has a manual for the game, and that'll be useful for understanding exactly what changed. It looks like the same set of game modes from the original Yars Revenge, but I don't see Ultimate Yars. Maybe the table goes to the next page and... that's weird. And it's the whole VCS owner manual. Yes, for some reason, AtGames lived up to their usual standard of quality with this collection, and the manual for Yars Return cuts off at page 2, and then the rest of the pages are the original VCS owner's manual. So we'll just have to figure out how to play as I go. The interface for the games is this console overlay. You can't switch any of this stuff while you're playing, though. You have to bring up the overlay again by hitting Options, and then selecting Console. I've turned everything up to max difficulty, Ultimate Yars mode, just like the previous Ultimate Yars mode, and the high-speed destroyer missiles. So let's dig into Yars Return. Since it is built on the original Yars Revenge, the gameplay concepts are already familiar to us. Get rid of the shield, absorb enough energy units by eating the shield pieces or touching the co-tile, activate the Zorlon cannon, and then shoot the co-tile to end the stage. You've got destroyer missiles tracking you. That's now missiles plural, but they can't harm you if you are in the rainbow bands. The co-tile sometimes turns into a swirl, and then that swirl shoots out. The big, obvious difference with Yars Return is that it's changed the Yars Revenge gameplay to be more like Star Castle. The co-tile's now hanging out in the middle, and that rainbow neutral zone covers 3 sides of the screen. All of this has some immediate, significant, and rather unfun effects on the gameplay. The co-tile's shield now occupies a much larger portion of the screen, and that gives you less room to work with. They compensated a little bit by making the safe zone thinner, but when you have 3 safe zones, you've lost all of that extra space that you recovered. So there's very little area in which your Yar can shoot its fireballs. Okay, not the biggest problem in the world, since most of the time you want to be eating the shield instead, but it's still making one of your tools pretty ineffective. You'll notice that one of the destroyer missiles is always lined up with the co-tile and only moves horizontally. That limits your ability to lure the missiles away and then go cut a hole straight to the co-tile. The screen still wraps vertically, but it doesn't wrap horizontally. It feels like it should, since the co-tile's now in the middle, but the left and right edges are still a hard barrier. Now you might notice that the neutral zone wraps around the co-tile shield on 3 sides, and that shield bumps up against the bottom edge of the screen. And surprising nobody, this winds up causing problems with that vertical screen wrap. If you try to go off the top edge, you bump right into the shield. And speaking of bumping into the shield, because of how Yars Revenge worked, you typically wouldn't interact with the shield from the top or bottom, and so shoving into it always pushed your Yar to the left. With the new layout, there should be more vertical interaction, but you're still solely shoved around horizontally. At least you go to the left when you're on the left-hand side of the screen, and to the right when you're on the right-hand side of the screen. When you're ready to activate the Zorlon cannon, you have to go to the far left. Yes, even though the co-tile is now placed in the middle, you still activate the Zorlon cannon the same way that you did in the original Yars Revenge. The cannon shot will appear on either the left-hand side, the right-hand side, or in some rare instances, the dead center. Where it will appear is random. I spent 20 minutes experimenting, seeing if I could do anything to control where the cannon appeared, and I can tell you that the cannon's position has nothing to do with how much of the shield has been destroyed, if the swirl is active, the proximity of the destroyer missiles, or your position on the vertical axis. I'm not willing to discount it being related to your score, or some kind of timer that you can track based on the neutral zone's coloring. From the perspective of a person just sitting down to play, though, where the Zorlon cannon appears is random. Of course, if it's on the left-hand side, then it fires to the right, and if it's on the right-hand side, it fires to the left, and if it's in the middle, then you automatically hit the co-tile, so it doesn't matter. The co-tile doesn't have any vertical movement in Yars Return, which means there's no need to aim the cannon. You open your hole, you activate the cannon, then you run around to the opposite side so you don't get hit, and fire it in. You can catch the rebounding shot to recover some energy, but there really isn't the space for it unless you specifically set something up to test that. It also makes hitting the swirl as it's firing extra difficult. Because there's no space on the inside of the neutral zone barrier to shoot, you have to fire it from the outside. And if you're on the same side as the cannon, then you are almost definitely getting hit. And if you want the swirl to move into the cannon shot, then you need to be on the same side as the cannon. What it comes down to is Yars Return undermines some of the basic gameplay concepts of Yars Revenge. It makes that gameplay significantly worse. Some of the tweaks, like a second destroyer missile, could have worked with the original setup, but placing the co-tile in the middle eliminates all of your maneuvering room, the restructuring of the neutral zone removes your options, and the Zorlon cannon is now just a mess. For somebody just messing around with the Yars Revenge ROM and coming up with Yars Return, you'd go, oh, that's neat that they did that, and that would be the end of it. But it's been presented to players as the Yars Revenge sequel, and it is a much, much worse game. Strangely enough, I am going to revisit Yars Return later on in this video, and some people take the concepts and actually implement them halfway decently. It's going to take me a while before I get there, though. For now, I'm advancing the timeline just 1 month, and we'll take a look at the other thing that our new Atari was doing to let people play Yars Revenge. Just 1 month after the Atari Flashback 2 unleashed an unplayable version of Yars Return on an unsuspecting populace, Yars Revenge returned to stores in an unusual package. A 3-in-1 combination cart for the Game Boy Advance containing Asteroids, Yars Revenge, and Pong. That cartridge was a latecomer to a massive wave of classic game re-releases on consoles that really kicked into high gear in the early 2000s. Game consoles were finally powerful enough that emulating 8-bit systems on these platforms was viable. Computers might have been able to do it for quite a while, but the processors in consoles were now fast enough, and were including enough memory that it was technically feasible, and emulation was understood well enough that people could make emulated games into a commercially viable product. When it came to old game re-releases before the 2000s, usually they were new ports rather than emulated games, though there are some interesting exceptions to that. This video is not about the history of emulation though, so we're going forward instead of backward. Obviously, a platform from 1977 was relatively easy to emulate, and so Atari began a series of re-releases of their classic games, bundled together for players into one convenient package. They were far from the only ones to do this. Activision, for example, had a collection of almost all of their VCS games, just lacking the ones where they couldn't get the license. The Activision Anthology was actually the gold standard for these packages at the time, since Activision tried to replicate the feeling of playing these games in a basement rec room in the 1980s. They did it complete with a diegetic soundtrack of 80s pop music playing on a radio you could find in the environment. And Midway, as the owner of the Atari Games properties, remember them from earlier in our story? That was the arcade division that became its own company instead of Atari Corporation. So Midway was also out there releasing emulated versions of classic Atari games, though for some of the more recent ones, they still had to do sneaky ports rather than emulation. Even Atari's competitors were getting in on this. The Intellivision Lives collection bundled every Intellivision game possible onto one disc for players. The Infogram GT Interactive version of Atari got on this train late. Midway and Activision had been doing some kind of re-release of their old games for 10 years before Atari got on board. But the first commercially released bundle of VCS games for people was released as Atari Anthology in 2004. On the PC it was Atari 80 Classic Games, but they're the same package. This collection included both the early arcade games that they owned, along with the most memorable of the VCS games. And of course, that included Yars Revenge. Following this, Atari would release a collection in a similar package every few years. 2005 brought the Atari Masterpieces to the N-Gage, and Yars Revenge is on Volume 1 of that. Atari Classics Evolved was released for the PlayStation Portable, and included remixed versions of some games, but fortunately for me, they didn't remix Yars Revenge. There was a two-part release for the Nintendo DS called Atari's Greatest Hits. Yars Revenge was relegated to Volume 2 for that one. On the Xbox 360, Yars Revenge was a standalone release as part of the classic Game Room line, a project that forces you to ask, what were they even thinking? 2016 brought Atari Flashbacks Classics, which I've already talked about. If you want to play Yars Revenge on the PS4 or Xbox One, then you want Volume 1 of that line, and if you want it on the computer, they called the collection Atari Vault for some reason there. The Evercade got their own Atari collection in 2020, and Yars Revenge is on Collection 2. And then after that, well, I'll actually talk about those follow-ups in a bit. I'm not going to go through the versions of Yars Revenge on each of those. The differences between the emulated versions is just going to be minuscule anyways. The point here is that for the past 20 years, if you wanted to play Yars Revenge, there's been some way that you could purchase it. You might have noticed that I didn't mention the Game Boy Advance cartridge, and that's because Atari didn't make it. Instead, it was created by DSi Games, a name that made a certain number of you out there spontaneously say, "Oh no." DSi Games were the makers of such fine titles as M&M Kart Racing, Chicken Shoot, and Harlem Globetrotters World Tour. DSi was responsible for a large percentage of the worst games released in the late aughts. In 2005, they hadn't built up that reputation yet. They were a small company with 3 games under their belt: Polly Pocket, Smashing Drive, and Monopoly, all for the GBA. But then someone at DSi had an idea. What if they made some simple games and bundled them together on GBA carts? They went out and got some licenses, not just from Atari, but also Midway and Hasbro, who somehow wandered back into this video. And in the space of 7 days, they released 9 cartridges for the Game Boy Advance. You got versions of Atari games like Marble Madness and Clax on one cartridge, and some board games like Risk, Battleship, and Clue. Oddly enough, Yars Revenge is the only VCS game represented in this series. The rest of the Atari games originated in arcades. I'm taking a look at that Asteroids Yars Revenge Pong cartridge, mainly because, unlike many of the other re-releases of the game, it has Yars Revenge on the box. To get the first obvious question out of the way, these are new ports, not emulated versions. And that makes sense if you think about it for a moment. The Game Boy Advance just has too low of a resolution screen to display asteroids like it was in the arcade. And Pong was built from analog circuitry and transistor logic. It can't be emulated since there's no software to emulate. Any non-arcade version that you've ever seen is actually a remake. Of course, the only game on the cart I'm interested in is Yars Revenge. And the initial impressions are actually kind of good. They scaled the game down to make it fit the GBA screen, but that's exactly what they needed to do. The game's a little bit more cramped, but it still works pretty well. There are some concessions for this, like when the Zorlon cannon shows up, it's in the play area. Don't worry, it can't hurt you until it fires. It does cause one significant difference though it's one I think works in this version's favor, since the destroyer missile has to move a pixel every time it updates, and now there's fewer pixels. The missiles are a lot faster in this version. After a few stages, it speeds up enough that you will not be able to get away from it. But I think ramping up the difficulty at that rate is just fine. There are some quirks here. I don't think the game plays as smoothly as the original did. And I encountered one particular bug that stands out. When the Kotile turns into a swirl and then shoots out, the Kotile appears back behind the shield as soon as the swirl fires. But, as you should be familiar with at this point, the Kotile is the swirl. That's why shooting the swirl advances the level. Well, if you shoot the Kotile after the swirl fires, but before it's off screen, then the swirl is still there when you go to the next stage. It continues on its destructive path. And if it happens to be where your Yar starts, well, tough luck. Another problem with this port is that there's no sound effect or feedback when you're munching on the shield. It takes longer than the original game to remove a chunk like this, and in the case of the shield where the dots within it are constantly moving, they've moved away before you've finished eating them. Eventually they'll come around again and then you can finish eating them, but there's no feedback toward that. So it just looks like you're mashing your face into the shield for a while with nothing happening. There are 4 game modes available in this version of Yars Revenge, and they map to the original 4 game modes. The game defaults to the first level challenge. You'll have to turn it to game mode 3 if you want Ultimate Yars. The DSi version of Yars Revenge is definitely not as good as the original, but it's also not a disaster like Yars Return. In 2005, if you had a Game Boy Advance and wanted to play Yars Revenge on the go, then this is a decent way to play it. You're not going to have any major complaints. It could have used a little bit more polish, but I guess when you're releasing 9 cartridges with 24 games on them in the space of a week, you really don't have the time to clean everything up. I've talked about the plug-and-play systems and the game collections, but what about the new games? When is Atari going to redo Yars Revenge for a new generation? And that's our next stop, all the way in 2011. 2011. The Infocrom GT Interactive version of Atari is about to crash headlong into bankruptcy, and I would call this the company's lowest point, but we're gonna get there. So let's go back to the state of the video game industry in 2011. Xbox Arcade and the PlayStation Store had properly caught on at that point, and there were several big hits that emerged from them that made publishing there awfully tempting. Game publishers were going through one of their regular rounds of, it's way too expensive to produce games, and this game made by 3 people sold 20 million copies. Why don't we make small games and make all the money instead? This phase is followed by, big super expensive to produce game made $1 billion? Why are we wasting our time on the pocket change that a 1000% return on investment for a small game would give us? So between Atari not having any money and small download-only games doing pretty well, it's only natural that Atari would try their luck at this. Atari would revive some old trademarks and make new games based on old ones. The concept had laid fallow for about 10 years at that point, with a Battlezone game for the PlayStation Portable being the only Atari retro revival game in that period. The games that Atari chose for this early 2010s revival were interesting. Haunted House, Star Raiders, Warlords, and the reason I'm talking about it, Yars Revenge. There was also an Asteroids game that was being worked on, and it actually got released on Steam as early access. It was going to be a survival base building style game, but it relied on servers that have been offline since 2017, so you can't play that one even if you wanted to. I'd say that this Yars Revenge is the best of this era of revival games. In fact, the others are so bad that I thought about looping them into this video, but no, gonna keep the focus on Yar. Just keep in mind as I'm playing it, that for all of the many problems that you're going to see, it's still the best of the era. This version of Yars Revenge reimagines the game as a rail shooter. It's very reminiscent of the style of Panzer Dragoon, and I'm not just saying that because it's a rail shooter. Yars Revenge isn't a copy, it's more that it's really easy to see the inspiration. Yars Revenge might have the same title, but it is vaguely a sequel to the original. And by that I mean the 2011 Yars Revenge has a plot that uses the comic that came with the VCS game as a springboard. It's vague enough that if you want to say that this six-armed woman is the same person as the giant fly in the first game, then, well, I guess it could be. Yars Revenge consists of 6 stages, not that you'd be able to tell. The first 2 stages look identical, and the last 4 stages look identical. Now this is going to be a little bit of a running theme here. The impression I have is that developer Killspace Entertainment, whose only game is this version of Yars Revenge, just weren't given enough time or resources to polish things. So there's really only about 5 enemies, not including the bosses. The levels all wind up looking the same. Stages wind up feeling like backdrops rather than things you're interacting with. Some of the special abilities aren't really distinctive. Yars Revenge has a whole bunch of little things that strike me as things that would have been improved with some polish. This is a game where I can practically feel the developer's frustration come through it. Nothing here says, low effort, let's turn this around fast and get our paycheck. Instead it feels like they're saying, here you are, but we could do so much more. I'm playing on the PC version, which is still available on Steam, and is not a great port. While there is a configuration tool where you can set the graphics options, these reset every time you open the game. And even though you can tell it to display things in a 16:9 aspect ratio, the game only renders in a 4:3 aspect ratio, squishing everything inward. The game is clearly expecting an anamorphic display, where your monitor is supposed to be taking the picture and stretching it horizontally. But it's 2026, nobody does that anymore. So for your sake, I took all of my footage, sent it off to my processing lab, and had them correct all of the video to what it's supposed to be. One catch with that, the cutscenes are not rendered this way. You just can't win. Those cutscenes are static images with no voiced dialogue, and you'll notice that sometimes they flash by faster than you can reasonably read the subtitles. In the opening cutscene, the Yar warrior is summoned by a bunch of robed figures who are definitely not evil, and sent off to attack their mortal enemies. Then you jump into the stage. They give you some brief pop-ups at the very start to tell you how to use the controls. These are completely wrong on the computer version. They are solely for the keyboard and mouse, and I'm playing with a controller. Let me run through the actual controls really fast so you can understand what I'm dealing with. The left stick controls Yar's position on the screen. The right stick controls the crosshair's position. The face buttons are used for special abilities that have to be collected. Your primary shooting is done with the right trigger, and it fires a continuous stream as long as the trigger is held down. You have a big lightning shot that's very effective against ground targets. This is activated with the right bumper, and it recharges after about 5 seconds. The left trigger is used to lock on missiles, and when you release it, they fire. You've got a limited stock of these, but they drop fairly often from enemies, and you'll want to use missiles on the hardened flying targets. The left bumper is used to initiate a speedy dodge roll, though you're not invincible as you do it. I had to keep the right trigger held continuously, and hit that right bumper about every 5 seconds. It didn't make for a comfortable play experience. As this is a rail shooter, you'll fly through every stage on, well, rails, until you reach a boss. And these bosses have pretty massive health bars. Even when they don't retreat and put up an invincibility shield while something's happening, you have to pound on them for a weirdly long time before they go down. It took me about 2 hours and 15 minutes to complete Yars Revenge. The final 45 minutes of that were 3 different attempts on the final boss. There's no tricks to make things go faster. The bosses don't have any weird techniques where you can aim at certain parts to cause more damage. and while there is a damage boost for you, it's very limited. All you can do is sit there and hit the boss for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and dodging your usually rather straightforward attacks, and hopefully they aren't slowly wearing you down. The 4 special items that you can use don't all show up immediately. There's 2 of them available on the first stage, the 3rd one becomes available on the 2nd stage, and then the 4th one becomes available after that. The most important ability that you have is regeneration. It'll surround your Yar with an effect that looks like the neutral zone from the original game. You can't fire during this, but you can still get shot. This effect restores your health, and using it recovers about 40% of your strength. The next 2 power-ups are very similar. You've got a lightning shot that flies out and shoots small attacks at anything that comes close to you. And then there's this purple ball attack that flies out and attacks enemies that come close to you. It can destroy larger enemies, and it bounces between them so it has more range. Finally, there's a weapon upgrade that makes your regular blaster do extra damage. These special abilities are limited use, and tokens to use them drop from enemies. You have to shoot the token to collect it. For each ability, you can carry a maximum of 2 uses. If you see a 3rd one come up, feel free to use what you've got. The items that drop from enemies are completely random. It seems like every enemy has a chance to drop something, and then their own loot table for things that you could collect. If you replay a stage or segment, then you won't necessarily get the same abilities. And if you just get unlucky, then you could wind up struggling at the end of the stage. If you've been watching this video and not just listening to it while you do something else, then you've probably noticed the multiplier scale on the far right. This increases when you destroy an enemy, and shrinks over time. Stronger enemies increase how much the bar grows, which means if you're shooting at a bunch of little guys that only take 1 blaster hit each, they might give you just enough to keep the multiplier stable rather than letting it increase. There's a lot of downtime sections in Yars Revenge, just portions where for about 10 seconds nothing's happening. And that's reasonable to let you cool down, but that also wipes out your multiplier. On top of that, the multiplier is frozen during boss fights, even if they've got assistants that you can kill. I guess they don't want you scoring the boss 20 times. You're given 3 lives to clear every level, and the game works on a checkpoint system, so if you die, then you'll just go back a bit and try again. Lose all 3 lives, and you have to play the stage over from the beginning. The way that Yars Revenge progresses is stage 1 and 2 takes place in kind of a jungle environment, and then after you beat the boss of stage 2, you go into a cutscene where apparently you lost, even though the game didn't show anything like that. You're woken up by an old guy who tells you that you've been brainwashed and have been fighting against your own people. Stages 4 to 6 all take place in an industrial environment, and initially you're looking for evidence that you really were brainwashed, and then you go kill the queen of the enemy. This computer boss is one of the very few references to the original Yars Revenge. That's the quotile on its screen. Once you defeat the queen, then your revenge is complete, and that's the end of the game. Yars Revenge is very clearly divided into 2 halves, but there's very little distinction between those 2 halves. Even though you switch sides, you're still fighting the exact same enemies. You've got the crawlers on the ground, the armored winged fighters, and a couple varieties of little bugs that swoop in. I think the only enemy that's unique to a portion of a game is that there are a handful of mechanical ships that you can shoot down in the second half. It makes everything feel very samey. When it comes down to it, there really isn't that much difference between stages 2 and 5. On top of that, the backdrops that you're fighting against are pretty much just backdrops. You can even see that to some extent when the camera spins, and the enemies that are on screen sometimes don't move with the camera. The terrain that you're fighting in has no effect on how you handle combat. You wind up feeling like you're fighting in a void, regardless of what the graphics on screen are showing you. Once you complete Yars Revenge, there are 3 challenge modes. One that gives you unlimited ammunition for your weapons, but no shield ability. One that takes away the shield ability and you only have half health. And one that drains your health if you don't have a multiplier going. There's also a small gallery of development art if you're interested in that. To me, the 2011 version of Yars Revenge winds up being a disappointment because I can see the promise here, but it doesn't live up to it. It really feels like a game that just kept getting cut back and then finally pushed out the door about 6 months before it was ready. It's not so bad that I'd say don't play it, but if you're going to have any fun with this, you've got to be a rail shooter fan with some really tempered expectations. And like I said, this was the best of the revival games from this era of Atari. Maybe someday I'll do a haunted house franchise video and we'll dig into the real horrors there. The good news for the Yars Revenge franchise is that we're now moving up to something better. Since we're now all the way up in 2022, yes, Atari survived their bankruptcy. They had to sell off a bunch of game franchises, which weirdly enough did a lot to make those games available for people. A huge portion of the old games that you'll find on Steam or Good Old Games are ones that small companies got out of Atari's grip during the bankruptcy auction. Atari shrank down to a company of less than a dozen employees, but they still survived. The following years for Atari would best be described as chaotic. You know, every bad idea that the video game industry has had since 2010? Well, Atari did it, but they did it worse than anyone else, and with so little attention that you probably wouldn't have even noticed. Why, there was Atari Casino. Not that Atari Casino, or the other Atari casinos that I will get to soon enough. This was their first mobile push, a series of casino games played on your phone with Atari game theming. They abandoned any pretense of Atari theming after a few months, and while I couldn't find an official announcement of its closing, the Facebook account for Atari Casino, which had a whopping 11 posts, hasn't updated since 2015. Around this time of Atari's mobile push, they teamed up with Denny's to make promotional versions of various Atari games themed around Denny's, quote, food, unquote. And as goofy as that was, it was still probably one of the smarter moves they made at the time. Then Atari announced a new console. It was originally to be called the Atari Box, and they attempted to fund it via Indiegogo. That funding campaign occurred at the end of 2017, and the console finally shipped in 2021. That console, retitled to the Atari VCS, in order to compete with Microsoft's Xbox One for customer confusion, was just a mini PC running a custom Linux setup. That did allow them to offer quite a few games in their online store, but sales for the Atari VCS were abysmally poor. That online store is still around, and even had a game released in 2026. It was the first new game in the store in 18 months, and it was a port of a 2-year-old game. But at the time of this recording, I can't really say that the Atari VCS is dead. The most successful ventures that Atari had at the time were free-to-play mobile games. The most successful of these would be Roller Coaster Tycoon Touch, which wasn't a smash hit, but it did well enough that it's being maintained to this day. In the late 2010s, Atari was drifting. And then in 2020, right as the pandemic was starting, Atari got a new chairman, and things get crazy. You thought they were crazy before? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. Reading between the lines, it seems like there was a power struggle between the incoming management, led by Wade Rosen, and the previously existing management, led by Frederick Chinet. 2 months after the leadership change, Atari announced a cryptocurrency. That got wrapped up in a new version of Atari Casino. Then they announced a series of Atari Hotels, and I could sort out the conflicting press releases and news reporting on those. Well, let's be realistic here. It wasn't going to happen, it never happened, and it never will happen. So there's no real reason to try to pull it apart. I'm afraid you'll never stay in the Missile Command suite. And of course there were NFTs. And as much as I'd love to make fun of NFTs for a few minutes, it's 2026 as I record this, and those jokes got beaten into the ground years ago. Shortly after the hotel announcement, Shanae left Atari to go to a cryptocurrency company, and Atari began disentangling themselves from all of their insane things that were announced in the previous year. One positive thing for Atari that happened in this year of chaos is that they started making games again. From 2014 until 2020, Atari released a grand total of 2 original console games. It wasn't that bad though. They also published 5 original computer games, most of which have been pulled down from sale. Everything else that Atari published in that time frame was re-releases of old games. These scraps of things from Infogrames, GT Interactive, and original Atari that they managed to hold on to through the bankruptcy. That started turning around in 2020 with the Atari Recharged line, a series of reimaginings of Atari's classic games. They were presented as budget indie games, taking the original action and expanding on it a bit. A consistent feature across the line of 10 game revivals was an arcade mode of escalating stages and a challenge mode that were one-off levels that were designed to, challenge you. And of course, one of these was Yars Revenge. Yars Recharge, we've dropped the apostrophe, reinvented Yars Revenge as a twin-stick shooter. On the one hand, that's a concept that feels like it's a dozen years late to the party in 2022. The flood of twin-stick shooters during the revival craze was long since gone. On the other hand, it's a gameplay structure that works really well for Yars Revenge. Steer the fly with the left stick, shoot with the right stick. The goal on every level remains the same: destroy the Kotile, though now there can be multiple Kotile floating around out there. The bits of the shield are now hexagon shaped, and when you destroy one, either by shooting it or running up to it and chewing on it, then it releases a little yellow ball. Collecting that ball, which you can do from pretty far away, builds an energy meter, and when that meter hits the top, then the cannon appears along with the safe zone on the left-hand side. You get into the cannon and hit the fire button to take your explosive shot. One convenient thing for you is that firing the shot uses some, but not all, of the energy bar that appears when the cannon does. That bar starts decreasing the moment it shows up, and you can keep it topped off by absorbing more energy, but really you're better off running back to it and firing the cannon, since that doesn't waste any energy, and you can get 2 shots off if you fire quickly. Early on, the Kotiles require 2 hits in order to destroy them, but on later stages, you'll have to hit them 3 times. By this point, assuming you're watching the video rather than just listening, you'll have noticed that the Kotile has a lot of other little pods around it. Those are Silurak cores, and they're the primary threat to your Yars. You'll see lines emerge from the Kotile connecting them to the Silurak, and when that line fills up, then the Silurak fires. There's several different kinds of Silurak. There's turrets that track your position, cannons that fire a continuous beam, wheel-like ones that shoot bullets in 6 directions, a particularly mean one that fires a bullet toward you that explodes into an entire shower of bullets, and ones that release a fountain around them. There is a pattern to the attacks. The Kotile will rotate through groups of Silurak, charging each of them up in turn. And on some stages, you have to take advantage of this rotating charging cycle to survive. The good news for you is that destroying a Silurak will also destroy many of the energy cells around it, and leave a power-up behind for you. The Silurak can take a huge pounding before they get destroyed, so it helps to get close because the bite attack from your Yars does a lot more damage than the bullets. Of course, you probably don't want to be close to one of those when it shoots. What power-up you get when you destroy a Silurak depends on the type of Silurak you destroy. The turrets give you rapid fire, the 6-shot ones give you a 3-way shot, and then things get weird. Beam cannons make you shoot a beam. which you can do once and happens automatically about 3 seconds after you pick it up. You don't even press fire, it just shoots out in the direction you're facing. Destroying the ones that fire an explosive shell gives you a power that makes you explode when you move and teleport a short distance. This will send you out of control and probably into the path of something you don't want to get hit by. At least when you collect a power-up, it's worth a lot of energy cells. And speaking of energy for the cannon, there's one other way that you can earn it, and that's by shooting a co-tile. Every time you hit it, an energy cell will pop out. That means if you need to collect energy from the co-tile, it's more effective to attack from range. The co-tile can still turn into a swirl and shoot at you, though it won't destroy you if you touch the co-tile while it's charging. You can shoot down the co-tile with the Zorlon cannon, but that doesn't harm the co-tile. On the other hand, shooting a charging co-tile prevents it from firing a swirl. On every level, your Yar is given 3 shields, and of course getting hit by a bullet or a beam will take off one of those shields. The swirl, on the other hand, is a special instance, since it will blow through all of your shields instantly. Getting hit by the swirl is fatal. Regardless of what mode you're playing in, once you start a new level, you've got 3 shields. And as you might guess from the game mechanics, later levels tend towards bullet-filled chaos. Yars Recharge has one more nasty trick to pull on you with every level. As you destroy the Silurat cores, more defenses activate. Initially, it will be bullets firing from the edge of the screen. But as you destroy more cores, the bullets will speed up, there will be large explosions, and the co-tile will start firing its own bullets in circles. So based on that, you might think it's better to just ignore the cores and just go straight after the co-tile. That's where the shielding starts to get complicated. There are now 3 different kinds of shields. Weak ones, which take about 3 shots to break, or 1 good chomp from your mutant housefly. Then there are strong ones that take a lot more damage, and then there's nearly indestructible ones. I say nearly because if you shoot them with the Zorlon cannon enough times, they will eventually break. But if you're firing the Zorlon cannon that many times, why aren't you just shooting the co-tile? The Silurat cores are often tied to those nigh indestructible shield pieces, so when you destroy them, then the firing path opens. And when you destroy the final co-tile, all remaining shield bits turn into energy balls, but you can't take them with you, so it doesn't matter. And now that you know how to play Yars Recharged, I can explain why it will hurt you. I mentioned before that one of my goals while making this video was to beat all of the games I talk about. At least the ones that could be beaten. And now to let you in a little secret, I don't produce these segments in order. When it comes to recording the games and working on the scripts, I've been bouncing around the timeline. Yars Recharged was the last game I played for this video. I saved it for last because I thought it was going to be the reboot that was the most straightforward. And in terms of gameplay it is. But then if you actually want to finish it, well, arcade mode consists of roughly 25 stages, and these get shuffled up a little bit every time you play. There's a couple of different layouts for the stages, and the order that they appear in is slightly different. The furthest I've gotten in arcade mode is stage 17. There are no continues. Once you die, it's back to the beginning. Getting to stage 17 took me about half an hour, and the levels are just getting larger and more complicated from there. You can develop strategies to minimize risk, but by the time you hit stage 10, you're dealing with swarms of bullets everywhere. You'll often be forced into cramped areas where there's no room to dodge, and mistakes will snowball quickly. I played this mode for days trying to make progress. Eventually, I just had to give up. I looked online for some advice, trying to watch videos of the game getting cleared, but there's exactly one video out there of someone beating the arcade mode. Okay, so I had to give up on arcade mode, but there's still challenge mode. 30 unique stages, each one played separately. I had to give up on that at stage 24. Once you're past about the halfway mark, there becomes 2 types of stages. Ones that completely box you in and prevent you from moving, and ones that don't. And for the ones that box you in, it was taking me 2 hours or more to clear a stage. for level 24, I've got about 5 hours of attempts on it. You see, on this level, there's exactly one breakable entrance on your way into the structure, and you need to loop around to the far side and then back again, and the very last Silhouette core, all the way at the back, opens keyholes to shoot the cotile through. I've tried going fast, I've tried going slow, I've tried clearing every single thing, I've tried just clearing a path. I've tried taking about 5 minutes to drill a single hole in the super strong blocks. I've tried going with the rotation of the level, I've tried going against the rotation of the level. What it comes down to is there's just no room for dodging, and this level has a technical issue. Now this might be something only with the Switch port, but you'll notice that the sound effects for the cotile firing the swirl are on a significant delay. On all of the levels I've got into, it only happens on this stage, and since I use that sound cue for dodging, and it doesn't start until the shot's ready to fire, it makes an already nearly impossible level significantly worse. You might have heard all of that and gone, oh, they must really hate Yars Recharged. And here's the funny thing, I don't. In fact, if you ask me for the best Yars Revenge game, I'd say it's this one. It might be a little simple and straightforward, but just like the original Yars Revenge, all the elements combine together really nicely. It's just that it also happens to be brutally difficult. I wouldn't be spending a full day trying to make progress in this game if it wasn't entertaining me in some way. And even if you can't beat the game, you can have a pretty good time with the levels that are there. There's even a co-op mode if you can convince a friend to join you, and I couldn't. Yars Recharged was exactly the right kind of thing to, well, recharge Yars Revenge. Unfortunately, it feels like it didn't get a lot of attention. So let me just say this. If you get any game that I talk about in this video, then actually it should probably be the next one. But if you get two, or if you only have like $10 to spend, sometimes it's on sale for $3, then get Yars Recharged. It is an excellent twin-stick shooter, even if it really wants to hurt you. As for that next game, well, the newly recharged Atari took a different approach when it came to re-releasing Yars Revenge. We're still in 2022 for the next Yars Revenge game, and this one gets a little bit quirky. Okay, I guess all of them have been kind of quirky, but Yars Revenge Enhanced is a little bit different because it was not a standalone game. Rather, it was released as part of Atari 50, the anniversary celebration. Yet another collection of Atari games packaged up and resold, but this time things were a little bit different. Because Atari 50 is the best collection like this that anyone has ever made. And I'm saying that because developer Digital Eclipse did something that I had talked about for decades. Atari 50 isn't simply a collection of games, it's a museum exhibit. If you've been to any modern museum, then you know they don't just put artifacts out in cases and line them up willy-nilly. There's a structure and flow to how they guide people through the artifacts. There's a story being told in how they're displayed. Your typical museum goer is just going to look in every case for about 5 seconds and then move on, and so it's important that they put everything into context. That extends to not only the actual stuff in the glass cases, but everything in how it's presented. On the other hand, video game collections are kind of bad as historical documents. I mentioned the Activision anthology a little while ago, and that was a good example of doing something right. The aesthetic presentation there helped put things into context. And as an earlier example of this kind of approach, the Namco Museum line for the original PlayStation offered very few games in its package, but placed them in environments that connected with those games. And when it comes to ancillary material, in most video game collections, you're lucky if you have a gallery of 10 pictures that's put off to the side. The approach in Atari 50 is the interactive museum exhibit. You can feel free to jump around if you like, but if you're following the exhibit, then you move along a timeline, presenting each game in its historical context, and with an enormous quantity of extra material sitting right alongside it. Since we're talking about Yars Revenge, let's use that. In fact, I used the Atari 50 to record my VCS footage for Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge was released right at a transition moment for Atari, just before Atari's business collapsed. And so Yars Revenge is the last segment in a chapter dedicated to the heyday of the VCS. If you were just following along on the timeline, then you've been getting details about how the VCS worked technically, checked out some of the most popular games for the platform, and got some details about how poorly Atari treated their developers in those days. The Yars Revenge section contains a lot of information from Howard Scott Warshaw, including 2 videos on the development of the game, the commercial shown in movie theaters for Yars Revenge, the comic book scanned well enough that you could read it on your TV screen, and at the very bottom, a new version of Yars Revenge Enhanced. And then once you've done everything you want to do with Yars Revenge, you go on and find out what happened to Atari in 1983. I'm sure nothing bad could happen to a company that's on top like this. Atari 50 contained several reworkings of classic games. There's a new version of Combat for 4 players, and a new version of Haunted House, a game that has had almost as many chances as Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge Enhanced was the most unusual of those, because it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's Yars Revenge Enhanced. They took the program code from the VCS version, made some changes so it would function widescreen, and then added a visual wrapper for it. If you don't like the high contrast glow and techno soundtrack, you can turn it off with a screen wipe that changes the game back to Yars Revenge. Since the new graphics are just an overlay, it doesn't even have to pause the game to do that. My biggest complaint about Yars Revenge Enhanced is that now there's no difficulty settings. So this is an instance where there is no Yars Ultimate to play. The cannon appears the instant you bite a piece of the shield off, or touch the co-tile, and the cannon shot doesn't bounce back. So for me, that makes Yars Revenge Enhanced a cool visual update, but if I want to play Yars Revenge, I'm going to stick to the VCS version. Atari 50 is a great package, a fantastic way to learn about Atari, and it has plenty of fun extras if you're already an Atari fan. The interactive museum aspects of it went over so well that Digital Eclipse kept doing it. They made similar digital museums for Karateka, Tetris, and Llamasoft. All 3 of those are excellent digital museums, though not nearly as grand or as elaborate or all-encompassing as Atari 50. Well, getting back to Yars Revenge, there's one more game to go, and it's the biggest Yars Revenge game. At last I have come to what is the final game in the Yars Revenge franchise. At least the final one as of this recording. I won't be shocked if Atari makes another swing at it in the future. Yars Rising feels like an attempt to kickstart the Yars franchise. That Atari were crossing their fingers, hoping for even a modest success here, and then continue onward with more Yars games. And to be honest, I don't see that happening. Whenever Yars comes next, I doubt it's going to be a continuation of Yars Rising. But let's jump backwards a little bit. As our timeline reaches 2024, we are now firmly in the era of Atari figuring out how to cash in on their beloved classic games. Besides the Recharge series, they've been doing things like Atari Mania, which is a collection of Atari-themed micro games, re-releasing classic games like Roller Coaster Tycoon, and most relevant for this discussion, new entries in classic franchises like Bubsy 4D. To make this new crop of games, Atari was reaching out to indie studios who already had some success under their belt. And one of those was WayForward. If you're into video games enough to watch a video about the Yars Revenge series, then you're probably already familiar with them. But if you're not, they're a developer who have found some success by making games in a classic style. WayForward made games like the remake of A Boy and His Blob and Double Dragon Neon, which attempted to reboot that franchise. And they've worked with Atari on just this kind of project with Centipede Infestation. Of course, that was 13 years before Yars Rising, and something like 3 Atari management structures ago. But still, they've revived a classic game for Atari before Yars. WayForward's biggest success has been the Shantae series, a series of platform exploration games. I'd say WayForward was a bit ahead of the curve as an indie developer there, since they were making those games before every other indie game was an exploration platformer. Atari went to WayForward and said, "We'd like you to make a new version of one of our old properties." No, seriously, that was the entire pitch. WayForward took a look at the library of options before them. They decided against Haunted House or Sword World, and picked out Yars Revenge. There were 2 things that attracted WayForward to Yars Revenge. The distinctive rainbow coloration of that neutral zone could be adapted to an entire visual style for the game, and the original game was flexible enough that it could be adapted into a set of mini-games as part of the new game. With those 2 hooks in mind, WayForward started development and made Yars Rising, a story-heavy exploration platformer. And while Shantae may have been ahead of the curve when it came to that genre, Yars Rising is way behind it. We've passed through the era when every other indie game was an exploration platformer, and now you've got to be a pretty amazing one if you want anyone to pay attention to your game. You might have noticed that no one paid attention to Yars Rising. I'm going to go through all of the game here, but I want to mention something up front so I don't have to keep hitting on it. Yars Rising is a story-driven video game, and that story is very bad. Major events are introduced in dialogue and cutscenes, with no reaction from the characters. Characterization shifts at every story beat. Characters take action for no other reason than the plot requires that they take that particular action. And then there's the dialogue. This isn't the fault of the actress who's playing the main character, Emi Kimura. She's just given dialogue that's quippy, and she never shuts up. She has some line about how absurd and stupid the situation is every time she enters a new room. And yes, I know it's absurd that the mega corporation has giant crushing machines in their corporate headquarters. Having your character point out how stupid it is makes me go, well then why did you make it this way?
That's a lawsuit waiting to be filed. Come on, Kotek.
Yars Rising isn't engaging in meta-commentary when Emi mentions how weird it is that the cleaning robots kill you, because that's all the game has to say about it. Every line of Emi's dialogue is like this, and she has a lot of them. It got on my nerves in about 10 minutes, and this is a 10-hour game. For what it's worth, I would have mentioned who Emi's actress was, but WayForward credited the voice actors as a group rather than crediting them by role, so I can't be sure. The impression I get from the plot of Yars Rising is that it's 3 or 4 drafts mashed together without a whole lot of editing. The kind of thing that would happen if you had a hard deadline and you had to assemble a final product out of all of the bits that you had. With that piece out of the way, let's begin the story, and not with the game. You see, part of the promotion for Yars Rising was that there was a Yars Rising comic. And this one isn't like the one included in the original Yars Revenge. Officially, the comic was published by Atari, but it was made with the assistance of IDW, a comic publisher who's made a lot of stuff based on popular licenses. It was written by Adam Tierney, who also wrote the story for the game, and the art is by Eleonora Bruni, who had only done work as a colorist before this. Presumably, this was an opportunity for her to do all of the art in an issue, since one-offs like this are often used as tryouts. This is a 24-page comic, and that brings with it some challenges. You need to establish everything quickly, give readers some interesting action, mostly resolve it, but leave a hook that leads into the next thing, the game in this case. Nothing happens in the Yars Rising comic for the first 12 pages, and 15 of the pages are people sitting around Emi's one-room apartment. The narration informs us that we are in Syzygy City in the year 2048, a typical cyberpunk dystopia. The narration goes on to inform us that our heroine, Emi Kimura, is part of a group of hackers seeking to bring justice to this cyberpunk world. And it has to inform us of this because we don't actually see any of that. Instead, we're introduced to Emmy as she transfers some petty cash from a corporation to her personal account. Emmy goes by the handle Yar online, and she has a mark that looks like the Yar sprite from Yars Revenge on her arm. The rest of the hacking crew arrive at Emmy's apartment one by one. There's Mal Foster, Emmy's childhood friend, Anthony Ochoa, whose handle is Kit Bash, and he's the cool guy love interest, and Cayenne Winters, who goes by Refresh, the generically dorky one. After a bit more self-introduction, where we don't see anything more than people sitting around, Mal tells the team about the hack they'll run tonight. They're going to pull a Superman 3 or Office Space on the Clax Casino. Mal has bribed a casino employee to give them a window to work in, but it's taken all of the group's money to do that. Since Emmy is the only hacker in this group of hackers, she sits down at her laptop, plugs in a USB drive, hits the keyboard for a few seconds, and goes, "I'm in." Emmy installs the hack and gets out before getting detected, but it's the hacker's bank account that's getting drained rather than the casino's. You know, their bank account that didn't have any money in it. But because their bank account is a local hardwired account, which I'm not even going to question how that works, the hacker from the casino that's stealing their money has to be in the building. The group rushes upstairs, spots the other hacker taking off, and then gets separated in the apartment building hallways. Emmy stayed behind to coordinate, but the hacker double-backed and attacks her. This action scene consists of him pulling a gun on her, Emmy begging for her life, and the mysterious hacker who somehow knows all about them leaving. But Emmy swapped the USB drive with their money on it with one that she had, and the day is saved. The comic wraps up with Mal announcing that they've got another big job lined up. Emmy will have to infiltrate the mega corporation Kotek and install a Trojan on their servers in person. So, as a comic, this is not good. It's a giant mountain of exposition that's being told to us. One of the strengths of comics as a medium is visual storytelling, and there's not much of that here. It's also a very wordy comic, something that is kind of common for people who aren't experienced with writing comics. Yars Rising was Adam Tierney's first comic, though he has had one more since then. Usually, you want to use words in comics when the art can't be sufficient. Needing a lot of words to cover things typically means that the writer didn't know how to structure a story for an artist. As a story, this comic is really heavy on the exposition. We're constantly being told things rather than shown them. Ideally, you'd be introducing the characters by having them do stuff, not by having them walk into a room, sit down, and be told about them. As a comic, Yars Rising is aggressively mediocre. Not bad enough to be memorable, just so bland and poorly done it's gonna slip right out of my head. A month from now, I will not be able to tell you a thing that happened in this comic. It is nothing. If I wasn't going for completeness, I would have cut this whole section out of the video. So let's move on to the main event. The game kicks off with a cutscene that is done as a comic. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about how the cutscenes work as comics. Emmy has woken up late and she has to rush into her job at Kotek. Now, even though she took this job so that she could rob Kotek, she's weirdly concerned about getting fired from that job in many of the game's cutscenes. After putting in a full day's work, it becomes nighttime and the game kicks off. One of the things I want to point out early on is that Yars Rising has a distinctive soundtrack. A lot of pop songs with vocals. One of the power-ups says that these are being played by Emmy's earbuds, and it'll even tell you the title of the track when it changes. On the other hand, Emmy has some jokes about how Kotek is playing the music over speakers. Before the game really starts, we go into the other style of cutscene, which is just character portraits popping up to talk. This is how we're introduced to the hacker team in the game, and to remind you, that's Mal, Kit Bash, and Refresh. For the most part, their job consists of marking the next destination on the map for you. The fact that they kept directing you to things that they shouldn't know exist made me think it was part of the storyline, But no, they're just telling you to go places because WayForward doesn't want you to get lost. At the outset, the only thing Emmy can do is jump. There's no way to attack. But you're quickly introduced to two of the game's big mechanics. First, there's stealth. There are a lot of locations in Yars Rising where there will be super guards, and you have to get past them without being seen. Usually you do this by jumping up to a hiding spot or by ducking into a doorway. If you're spotted, then they'll shoot you and you have to restart the room. There's a dedicated sneak button that will make you move more slowly, but sneaking does absolutely nothing. You can run at top speed and they still don't hear you. On top of that, it's actually kind of easy to avoid guards if they spot you as long as you're not in a confined area. The stealth sections, and there's a lot of them, wind up being pretty trivial. The other significant feature that you're quickly introduced to is hacking. And if you're going to play Yars Rising for anything, it's for this. It's the best implemented, most unique feature of the game. When Emmy approaches a terminal and chooses to hack it, then you go into a minigame. And the minigames are mostly based on Yars Revenge. You're controlling the fly, there's a co-tile, and you need to destroy the co-tile in the same way that you did in the previous games. You get a charge for your cannon, and then shoot the co-tile. If the fly gets hit, then Emmy takes a little bit of damage, and you can just try again. The thing is, there's a lot of variations on Yars Revenge here. Many of the hacking minigames lead to some kind of power-up, and what you have to do in the minigame reflects that power-up. So you might have to eat all of the shields rather than destroy the co-tile. Or you might have to shoot down centipedes. Or you might just have to reach a key. There are some general rules that carry over. Orange shields can be shot or eaten. The teal shields can only be shot. And the magenta shields can only be eaten. And gray shields have to be shot by the cannon. Shields that have a dot placed in them are indestructible until you touch a key. Usually you have to go back to a neutral zone to activate the cannon. Beyond that, pay attention to what it's telling you at the bottom of the screen. The goals and abilities will change, but they'll tell you what you need to do. Major upgrades are kept behind multi-stage hacking minigames. You'll have to clear 3 levels of something before you get the upgrade. For minor upgrades and unlocking doors, you only have to clear 1. The big thing about the hacking minigame is that they found a ton of different ways to implement it. So you always have some new distinct challenge when you hack into something. After you've cleared a hacking minigame, you can play them from the main menu, and you'll get a medal if you clear them fast enough. One of the small miracles in the hacking minigames is that they implemented Yars Return, but they did it right. On the Yars Return levels, which neutral zone you go into determines which side of the screen the cannon fires from, and that includes the top. And everything is scaled appropriately thanks to being in a widescreen format, so you're not squished between the neutral zone, the shield, and the side of the screen. If you want to play Yars Return, then Yars Rising is the way to do it. If you fail a hacking minigame too many times, then you're given the option to make things simpler. I never use this myself, but if you need the help with the arcade games, it's there for you. The hacking minigames have 3 functions in Yars Rising. They're used to unlock doors. The multi-stage hacking minigames are used to grant you new abilities. And finally, it's how you acquire modifiers. This is the other big innovation in Yars Rising, though in the 2 times that I played it, it didn't have that much of an impact. Sometimes when you clear one of these hacking minigames, you get a little geometric symbol, a few blocks. And you can use this to fill in a Yars sprite, taken straight from the VCS game. As the shapes get more complicated, you can rotate them to make them fit. These pieces have effects like granting you extra health, increasing Emmy's damage, adding abilities to make the hacking minigame simpler, and enhancing her movement upgrades. Those enhancements are actually sometimes needed to access certain optional locations, and they're a bit emblematic of the problem with this upgrade system. While you can go in and out of the menu, changing your loadout for every scenario, because it's dependent on a geometric structure, trying to change one thing often means you need to change many things. There's maybe 4 or 5 times as many upgrades as you can fit into the Yars sprite. If you try to change for every situation, you're going to be spending an absurd amount of time fiddling with positions. What I wound up doing is plugging in all of the movement upgrades, adding some max health, max energy, and max damage upgrades, and then just letting it sit. Hacking upgrades were dropped in as placeholders, but if I had anything else better, they were gone. Also, the item that tells you what song is playing fits into the Yars symbol. So if you want to know what the soundtrack is, you have to sacrifice a power-up. With those explanations of the basic game mechanics that we'll be dipping into over and over again out of the way, let's hop back to the story. Emmy hacks and sneaks her way through a few obstacles and reaches the terminal that she was hired to access. After hacking the terminal, which opens a door somewhere, Emmy is caught by the head of security for Kotek, Mrs. Davidson. Emmy's hauled off to a room where a robot is guarding the exit, but there is a convenient vent for her to crawl through. The vent leads straight to the first glowing terminal, the devices that act as your upgrade points. Successfully hacking it grants Emmy the Zorlon shot, her primary gun for the game. With that, she can fire tiny rainbow blasts and blow up the robot that was guarding her cell. From this point on, your friends will tell you to go someplace to escape the building, and then you'll go there and there is no escape, but there is another upgrade for Emmy. Also, no one seems especially concerned that hacking a computer mutated Emmy enough that she shoots laser beams from her hands. I mean, they'll mention that it's mutating her. It's just no one really seems to care that it's mutating her. You have a map as you explore the building, and you'll notice that the world that you're exploring is not very large and not very complex. There's very few loopbacks or alternate access ways. It actually becomes a bit annoying in the late game cleanup, where something you're required to get is at the end of a very, very long linear section that you've already been through. A lot of the environments look extremely similar too. I understand this was a low-budget game, but there's still very little character to anything. It's generic office, generic mechanical area, generic cityscape. It's functional, but there's no moment in Yars Rising that'll make you go, oh wow, that looks cool. Maybe the best you get are references, like how the save points are all computer space machines. The second major upgrade you locate in Yars Rising is Trionic Nibble, which lets you absorb force fields. So with only one major exception, it's essentially a key. Naturally, that one exception comes up pretty quickly, since the next waypoint you go to is a hangar where Mrs. Davidson shows up again and sicks a giant robot on you. That giant robot has a force field that you have to eat through before you can damage it. Also, its bulk takes up so much of the screen, and its movement restrains you so much, that I thought I was overlooking some key movement ability that would let you dodge faster, slide under it, double jump over it. But no, Emmy is just slow and pokey, and you have to go to the edge of the room to avoid most of the attack patterns. After you take down the giant robot, with a little bit of hacking to finish it off, Emmy takes Mrs. Davidson's key card so that she can get out of the building. Also, there's a bit of a conversation where we get told, you don't really know what's going on, do you? And that's going to be weird in a few minutes' time when it turns out that Mrs. Davidson doesn't have any idea of what's going on. The next leg of Emmy's journey takes her into the secret lab below Kotek, and that's where she finds the destroyer missiles. It's a more powerful shot that uses up energy cells, and also can blast through big metal doors. We get our next big story moment down here, as Emmy finds a lab that has a bunch of fly people stuck in tubes. The sight of them triggers a flashback, and Emmy remembers that as a child she was visited by one of the fly aliens, and after talking to it for about 20 minutes, the alien gave her the Yar mark on her arm. With that non-mystery solved, Emmy spots a mysterious figure in a bubble helmet dissecting one of the aliens, and after it makes vague threats, it runs off. So obviously that's going to be very important. Oh, no, wait, sorry. That guy, who presumably is Kotile, never appears again. Anyway, up to this point, you've only been fighting robots and human guards, but now some places have insect monsters. Proceeding further into the underground lab, Emmy finds a terminal that gives her grasshopper legs. I mean, not literally, they still look like human legs. It's just now she can wall jump. With that extra mobility, Emmy finds a shaft that goes even deeper underground to an old room with boarded up windows where there's a half-human, half-spider ready to fight her. The Spider-Woman goes by Black Widow because that's an Atari game. In the fight, Black Widow mainly sticks high off the ground, so you have to wall jump to hit her, and you'll run out of energy for missiles pretty quickly. You'll have to recharge that by absorbing energy from the spiders that emerge from the eggs she drops. She also fires big web balls that get destroyed when you shoot them, and can slam her big legs into the ground. The toughest part of the fight is that she can shield herself with some webs and then fire a giant barrage of shots. But if you've got energy for the missiles, then you can bounce off the wall, break the webs with the missiles, and take her out. Mrs. Davidson has been in contact with you during the fight, and she's shocked that you are out of the building, and also somehow in contact with a giant spider monster. Though really, she has to take your word for it on the giant spider monster thing. Anyways, this is enough for her to turn against Kotek, and she unlocks the front entrance for you. With a bit of backtracking, and possibly collecting items that are now reachable, Emmy gets out of the Kotek building and hops a train to travel the 3 screens back to her apartment. Once she arrives, her friends are gone. They didn't even stick around for her to come back. And I know you're thinking they've been kidnapped and this is the setup for the next part of the game, and you are wrong. Well, not about it being the setup. No, as Emmy flops down on her bed, Mrs. Davidson calls again, and in the 5 minutes between Emmy leaving the spider boss and returning to her apartment, Davidson has discovered that Kotek CEO Philip Ong is actually a villain. She mailed Emmy 2 electronic tokens, really just USB sticks, that act as a key to get back into the building. With the alien invasion happening, Emmy has to get back to the Kotek building to stop it. Yes, there's an alien invasion. This is the first line that's mentioned it, and it's apparently overrun the city in the 30 seconds between Emmy opening the front door of her apartment and getting that phone call. Everybody in this cutscene is weirdly efficient. Anyways, your friends just took the USB sticks and ran off for no good reason. And you can't re-enter the Kotek building until you get those back. And so now you're exploring the city, which is a much, much smaller area than the Kotek building. That's not really a complaint. The game needs to be scaled as appropriate. It just feels weird when the city map is 1/10 the size of the Kotek building, and the two are directly attached side by side. Her friends took the USB sticks, which conveniently have trackers on them, and Emmy needs to head right back out to recover those keys, go back into Kotek, and stop the ongoing alien invasion. You'll also have to find a couple upgrades before you can access the building again. First up are pond skater boots that let Emmy walk on water. She can't swim, so she has to walk on top of it for now. The other item is a Firefly drone. It uses energy to launch a bug up that you can then steer with the D-pad, and its main use is to activate or deactivate certain force fields so that you can open new paths. Technically, you can also use it as a weapon, but if you're going to do that, you're locked in place as you steer it around, so it's a really bad idea to use it as a weapon. With these 2 upgrades, you can find Kit, Bash, and Refresh, and they're just hanging around in random locations. Mal is nowhere to be found at the moment. With the keys from them, you can access a path back into Kotek. But first, it's time for another boss battle. This time against the boisterous Missile Commander. The Missile Commander's thing is flying around and shooting balls of energy at you. Small ones that home in on you, slightly larger ones that fall from the top of the screen, and sometimes from the background he'll shoot really big balls of energy. If the small energy balls hit the ground, then they can destroy a panel, and even though Emmy can now walk on water, she'll get hurt by it if she steps on it here. You can destroy Missile Commander's shots before they hit the ground, and it's a good idea to do that because that's how you restore energy in this fight. Honestly, this guy is an enormous pushover. Once the Missile Commander is down, you're back in the Kotek building, and now your goal is to reach the roof. This turns out to be the toughest part of the game, the only place where the platforming is really challenging, since they put in a lot of dangerous obstacles. And of course, now you can double back everywhere, collecting all of those upgrades that you place into the yard, because now you have the movement ability to get them. On the way to the roof, Emmy is called by the alien that she met as a child. Yeah, just calls her up out of the blue. The alien is the one that hired her to hack the Kotek systems, and it lets Emmy know that Philip Ong's plan is to build a giant portal on the roof of Kotek, which the Kotile will then use to invade the Earth. Invade the Earth more. Ong thinks that they're going to rule the planet together, but Emmy's alien friend lets her know that the Kotile are planning to betray him. Throughout the next section of the game, the alien will call Emmy periodically to tell her to go to the roof and destroy the portal. In this region of the game, Emmy picks up 2 more movement abilities, the Dragonfly Dash, which zips along horizontally, and the Fly Wings that shoot Emmy straight up at the cost of a bit of energy. You can combine these 2 moves to do some pretty complicated acrobatics, and in fact the very first thing that they want you to do with the Fly Wings is just that. Jump up into the air at a very precise location, do a dash, and then at the end of the dash fly up, and then turn back to catch a ledge. It's the single most complicated maneuver in the game, and it's the very first thing they want you to do with the ability. After a bit more running around, Emmy makes it to the roof where her alien friend is waiting for her, which just raises questions why the alien needed her. But maybe he did, because that's when the missile commander shows up again. And he has Mal. But then Mal shoots the good alien, because it turns out that the person whose name means bad is a bad guy. Who would have thunk? They needed to use Emmy to lure out her alien friend. But it turns out that Mal giving you directions to turn your body into a biological weapon has backfired. The missile commander departs before the fight, saying you haven't seen the last of him. You've seen the last of him. And then it's time for a showdown. Mal has abilities fairly similar to Emmy, though she can also hover in place and fire a bullet pattern. As a dramatic showdown between friends, this might have been more effective if we had any sense of their friendship. They spend the fight arguing about things and stress points in their relationship that we haven't seen. So Mal winds up being just another boss fight. When you defeat her, Mal curses Emmy with her dying breath, and then Philip Ong finally comes out. He gives his little villain speech and then activates the portal. That would be the portal that for the past hour the game has been telling you absolutely must not be activated. So this must mean that you're heading into some big awesome battle for the final act of the game, right? Well, no. The portal activates, he goes through, and then nothing happens. Emmy follows him through the portal and winds up on the Yar homeworld. And this really is the final area of the game, though there's still some backtracking to do. When Emmy meets the Yar, she is told that they need to restore power to the Zorlon cannon in order to stop the Kotile. The problem is, the 4 flies with the command code to activate the Zorlon cannon have all been captured. And that means Emmy will have to go back to Earth, rescue the 4 of them, and then that will let her fire the giant shot to break the barrier before the last boss. The Yar also give Emmy a superhero outfit, which is just a cosmetic change. It doesn't make you take less damage or give you any new abilities. Before returning to Earth, Emmy gets her last upgrade, the Mayfly Gills. These will let you walk underwater for a little while. But even though they're called gills, you still have to breathe. And with that, every single area in the game is now accessible. Naturally, the 4 people you have to rescue are all held in cells that you have to travel underwater to reach. If they weren't, you would have rescued them already. Since you have to run all over the world anyways, this is the best opportunity to collect all of the stuff you passed by. Once Emmy's rescued everyone and gone back to activate the Zorlon cannon, she discovers that she is the Zorlon cannon. It's a real, okay, so what, kind of reveal. The Zorlon cannon is a charge attack. You have to check your power-ups menu to get told that. Because it's at the end of the game, really the only uses for the Zorlon cannon are smashing the barrier and hitting the final boss. With that done, you run the final gauntlet and confront Philip Ong. And to defeat him, you engage in a game of Pong. Philip Ong, get it? This is the hardest fight in the game since Pong doesn't translate well to joysticks. If you reach 5 points first, then you'll defeat Ong, and you'll find out that things aren't finished yet. He's summoned an evil Kotile god to attack the Yar, and is using that as coverage for escaping. And yes, the first time that any evil Kotile god has been brought up in the game is 1 minute before you fight it. It shows up as a giant, but what you're really fighting is the crystal that's floating around. The crystal periodically opens up to reveal its core, and when you shoot that enough times, the covering comes off. That lets you hit the core with a Zorlon cannon blast. That'll make the shield around the core reform, and the attack patterns get more aggressive. Hit that crystal's core 3 times, and you win. Ong gives a villain speech that his alien armadas are coming and nothing can stop him, and Emmy just walks away as he's doing that. The Yar planet starts exploding, so Emmy runs back through the portal, and finds Hit, Bash, and Refresh waiting on the other side for her. She has to let them know that Mal's dead, which they probably should know since her body's right there. Anyways, game's over, so they're all going out for ramen. Roll credits. Completing the game unlocks Professional Mode, which is hard mode for the game. The changes in Professional Mode are that enemies take more damage to kill, and they do more damage to you. It doesn't do anything to really change up the gameplay. Okay, throwing out the story and ignoring it, how is Yars Rising as a game? And really, it's kinda mid. Exploring the Kotek building, the Yar planet, and the city just isn't that interesting. For the first 3/4 of the game, the environments are pretty boring. Complications are introduced way too little, way too late. All of the power-ups that Emmy acquires to help explore are almost all the generic powers that every exploration platformer has. The big exception there is the Dragonfly, which isn't really unique, but it's different enough to stand out. Unfortunately, it locks you into place, so all you wind up using it for is a key. Emmy doesn't have a lot of mobility in combat until the very end of the game, and even then the flight and air dash are kinda clunky to use. So fighting things isn't very much fun either. The strength in Yars Rising is the hacking minigames. They're very well integrated, and I especially liked how the minigames reflected what you were getting. The minigames being so good is actually kind of a problem, because primarily in the game, you're going to be doing the boring bits. Yars Rising isn't a badly made game by any stretch. You can see the visual quality for yourself, and like I mentioned, the soundtrack is excellent. It's just that as an exploration platformer, it kinda just sits there doing the bare minimum. When it comes to exploration platformers, you could play a dozen better games than this. A dozen better games that were made by WayForward. Yars Rising just left me with a deep sense of disappointment. Everyone involved could have done this better. And it really hurts since you can see glimpses of its potential. And that brings me to the end of the Yars Revenge series. It's a bit amazing that a quirky game for the VCS has such a long legacy. There's only one other original VCS game that comes close to this kind of scope. What's next for everyone's favorite mutant housefly? Well, I think it's unlikely that we're going to see a sequel to Yars Rising. However, Howard Scott Warshaw has spoken for decades of making a proper sequel to Yars Revenge. And we're in an era when retired game developers might actually do something like that as a hobby project. And while Atari may not have a Yars Revenge project going right now, I wouldn't be shocked if there's another game before we reach the 50th anniversary. Yars Revenge is a concept that's flexible, that it can keep coming back. I think that anytime someone looks at reviving some Atari VCS stuff, Yars Revenge is going to be at the top of the list. People just love the housefly.
on cannon. Yars Revenge. Try to eat the quantile. Yars Revenge. Got to break the quantile shield. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Look out while here comes the sword. Yars Revenge. Here comes a destroyer missile. Yars Revenge. Don't you touch the quantile. Yars Revenge. You want to get it wrong. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Yars Revenge. Shelter in the neutral zone. Yars Revenge. Got to fire the Zoid on cannon. Yars Revenge. Try to eat the quantile. Yars Revenge. Got to break the quantile shield. Yars Revenge. Look out now, here comes the squirrel. Yars Revenge. Here comes a destroyer missile. Yars Revenge. Got to touch the quantile. Yars Revenge. If you want to get it wrong. Yars Revenge. Shelter in the neutral zone. Yars Revenge. Got to fire the Zoid on cannon. Yars Revenge. Try to eat the quantile. Yars Revenge. Got to break the quantile shield. Yars Revenge. Look out now, here comes the squirrel. Yars Revenge. Here comes a destroyer missile. Yars Revenge. Got to touch the quantile. Yars Revenge. If you want to get it wrong. Yars Revenge. Got to break the quantile shield. Yars Revenge. Try to